Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on healthcare investments and subsectors to watch in 2024. We're going to give everybody just a minute to log in. It looks like we still have a number of people. So if you'll just bear with us, we'll be back with you in about a minute or two to get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we have a pretty critical mass of people that have been able to log in, so we may have some others join us as we get started, but we'll go ahead and get going here. Very nice to meet you all, at least virtually. I think many of you I've interacted with before, either at our conferences or through our webinar series. We're really excited to have you today to talk about some of the subsectors that we're watching for active growth in 2024. A lot of these subsectors are some of the same subsectors that we saw have really positive growth at the end of 2023, but there's also some new ones that we're seeing really popping out this year, and we expect to continue to see more of. So my name is Kayla Marty. I'm here as a partner at McGuireWoods. I sit in our healthcare department, and I'll be here alongside one of my colleagues, Brian King, who will be presenting on a number of other subsectors as well. I think most of you all have had an occasion to interact with McGuireWoods, like I said, either through webinars, conferences, or maybe having met us in person at some of our different healthcare pop-up events. But for those of you who don't know us very well, we're a firm of many different offices across the country. We have about 1,000+ attorneys that are spread throughout the United States and Europe. But one thing that is really unique to McGuireWoods is that we have about 50+ attorneys that are devoted to healthcare 100% of the time. And then we have about another 75 or more attorneys who spend a significant amount of their time in healthcare, whether it be supporting healthcare from a tax, debt finance, employee benefits, or other regulatory perspectives. So it's an area that we really like to spend a significant amount of time in. We are not uniquely a buy-side, sell-side, or specific subsector firm. Rather, we represent strategic buyers, we represent sellers, we represent private equity funds, independent practices, payers, a wide variety of different players. So many of you that I see on the call come from those different backgrounds, and probably many of the same points we're going to talk about today will resonate with you because, again, it isn't really just particular individual groups that are interested in these areas. During the call today, we're going to focus on both transactional and regulatory issues that come up in each of these subsectors and the reason why they're either attractive or challenging in different parts of the country or in different subsectors within the heading. For those of you who do regularly engage in our thought leadership, thank you for doing that. We always love to have you. One thing that I wanted to mention, though, is upcoming on May 8th and 9th, we have our annual Healthcare Private Equity and Finance event in Chicago. If you have not registered, we would love to have you. It's a wonderful event. It has more than 1,000 participants each year with different individuals from independent practices, health systems, payers, private equity funds, and obviously capital providers. So we'd love to have you at any of them. If you are very interested in the things that we talk about today, the basis for this presentation is partially a white paper that we published that is a deep dive in a number of different subsectors. We'd be happy to share that with you. We would love to interact with you on it at any time. Please feel free to reach out. And then just a couple of administrative items. If you are an attorney, we are offering CLE for this presentation. If you did not input your CLE information at the time that you registered, please feel free to reach out to anyone on the invite, and they will help you make sure you get CLE credit for it. If you have other questions that are very specific about any of these subsectors, please use the Q&A box to put in those questions. We're happy to answer them as they come up. We are also happy to talk about them offline to the extent that they're extremely specific to your organization. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started and really jump into the substance here. Like I said, my name is Kayla Marty. I'll be doing the first part of the presentation, and then Brian will be jumping in to do several subsectors as well. So here are the subsectors that we're going to be covering today. Like I mentioned, there's been a significant amount of deal activity in each of these spaces already. These are by no means brand new subsectors that no one has been doing work in 2023. But they are subsectors that we view as on the rise, and on the rise for many different types of investors. So strategics, payers, and private equity funds, as well as kind of conglomeration transactions where we're seeing independent providers to independent providers banding together and maybe eventually looking for another outside investment or for outside capital. So each of these we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but these are going to be the topics. So just jumping right in, I'm going to spend a little time talking about aesthetics and med spas. I see that we have many people dialed in from both private equity funds and investment banks. I would be absolutely shocked if you all have not been seriously looking at aesthetics and med spas for a variety of different reasons, and different parts of the country and different geographies have different components of each of these issues. But it is one of the single hottest sectors that we are seeing at the end of 2023 and into the beginning of 2024. And we think that that's particularly true as inflation has decreased and as the economy has begun to rebound, where we're seeing there is more cash pay available and there is pretty large underserved demand for aesthetics and med spa services. You can see here, based on some of the data that we've included on the slide, that this is an area that is expected to have extremely significant growth potential, perhaps more than any other subsector that we're going to talk about today. By 2026, there are estimates that it could rise to $25.9 billion, which would be more than a $10 billion increase. So it's undeniable that that's an area that it has evidence need and demand from consumers. There's also some studies that are showing that we're going to see increases at about 14.9%. all the way through 2030, which is unprecedented for many other subsectors. And that, again, is primarily driven by demand that we're seeing in the market and the different areas and sites that these services can be provided. Obviously, aesthetics and med spa are an extremely broad category of services. They can be offered in standalone sites. They can be offered as a component of existing businesses. And so we think it has a lot of opportunity, both as a standalone subsector for pure play aesthetic and med spa transactions and investments, but also as a component of other subsector investments you may be looking at, such as dermatology, dental, and others. So I think that you're going to see, as we talk about, there's a lot of optionality, there's a lot of diversification, both of products and service lines, that makes this area particularly attractive. The other thing that makes this subsector really attractive is the ability to have unique and new investors. So obviously in healthcare, we have historically seen investments by payers, investments by strategic healthcare providers, and we have seen investments by private equity or other financial investors. Med spas and aesthetics are a little bit different. It introduces a completely new group of people that could be potential acquirers, such as cosmetic and drug companies, or even seeing some hotel chains or product companies investing in these areas, which is provide some additional competition, but also some additional opportunity. There's been a lot of questions and discussions about why investor appetite is so strong in aesthetics and med spas. One is like fairly high margins. That is, in my opinion, driven by product cost and the ability from a cash pay perspective to charge particular costs with product or particular sales costs with product costs remaining relatively low. The other component is it tends to have slightly lower labor costs than we're seeing in some other subsectors. There are some types of aesthetic services on a state-by-state basis that are required to have heavy clinician involvement from a physician perspective, and obviously those individuals are extremely highly compensated. But in many of the aesthetic services and med spa service lines, physicians are not required by state law to provide the services themselves directly. And so that can often lead to some lower labor costs than in some other subsectors of healthcare. The next is the lack of exposure to government and commercial payers. A vast majority of aesthetic and med spa services remain cash pay and remain very elective in nature, as cosmetic obviously would suggest. And so that leads to less volatility outside of macroeconomic conditions for choices by payers and both commercial and government. So that remains fairly attractive both from a reimbursement perspective and from a compliance perspective. As I mentioned earlier, many of these services are non-medical. So we are seeing investments by people like hotel chains and resort providers, which is obviously different than what we see in hardcore medical subsectors. There's also a continual recurrence of service opportunities chosen by the particular consumer. And so it's very familiar, I'm sure, for many of you on the phone to see packages sold of these type of services, which provide certainty of recurring revenue in addition to patient discounts and things like that that are attractive to patients. So that's another place where we're really seeing a lot of interest and a lot of investment. The other is service line growth. So aesthetics and med spas are an extremely large category. Within each of those categories, we see things like facial products, we see things like Botox, we see things like certain type of laser services. All of those are attractive areas for sub-growth, and we expect for that sub-growth to continue as new technology develops, as new products develop that consumers continue to be really interested in. And the last, this is a theme in each of these subsectors that we're going to talk about. It's an extremely fragmented market. There's still very few large providers of these services across the United States and even across certain regions, so that makes it very attractive. I'm going to hit just a couple of things before I move on to the next subsector about challenges that this area presents. If you're looking at transactions, if you're considering the med spa space, you need to be very careful about corporate practice of medicine issues and making sure that any services that are being provided that are considered the practice of medicine are being done in compliance with various state laws. That's very important for licensed individuals. It's very important for formation. You do not want to run afoul with any of those requirements. The other thing is states over time have started to enact licensing requirements for med spas or areas providing aesthetic services. So making sure you continue to be in compliance with those licensure requirements is extremely important, and that you're in compliance with proper supervision. So to the extent that a service is the practice of medicine or requires a clinician involvement, it's very important to make sure that you're having the proper supervision structures in place, having the proper documentation in place. If you don't have that, that can lead to a lot of significant issues. And then understanding your service lines. med spa and aesthetic services are a very broad topic area, and so they can result in specific regulation of specific service line on a state-by-state basis, such as Botox, which does have a lot of state-by-state regulation. The next subsector we're going to talk about, and we're going to hit this one just a little quicker because I do think most of you are likely familiar with it in greater detail, is behavioral health. Behavioral health remains an extremely attractive subsector. Even though there has been a lot of development, there has been a lot of investment interest, there still is very little consolidation, and it's an extremely broad topic area. We're seeing a lot of growth in mental health services, substance abuse services, and then also autism and intellectual development disabilities. There has been a destigmatization of that type of treatment, and then also significant advances in technology and products that support that industry, that we're seeing a lot of growth and a lot of need by patients from a clinical perspective, that they're really demanding or encouraging growth in that subsector. And so we expect to see that continue here through the next part of 2024 and likely into 2025 as well. Of course, as everybody knows on this call, one of the big drivers is the opioid epidemic, and then also the increased awareness of mental health access. This is one area, like many other subsectors that we're going to talk about, that has a real need and demand for services because of the lack of access to care and the lack of quality assets to provide those type of care to patients. And so despite having significant economic pressures and challenges to the industry, such as labor costs, we still expect to see a wide variety of investment in this area. Specifically, we've seen more interest among strategic investors and a growing interest by payers to try to reduce the total cost and continuum of care by getting treatment and access to mental health care that people are really wanting. Sorry, everybody, I didn't flip our slide before, but we'll go ahead and flip now. So like I've talked about previously here, some of the drivers of this increased activity are undeniably the destigmatization for patients of behavioral health services. There's greater knowledge, there's greater recognition among the clinical community and the community at large that there needs to be access for these type of services, which has really spurred both the development but also the need for continual efficiency such that the current assets in the market can meet the need that patients are really demanding. Because of that need, we're also seeing increased reimbursement for these services. It's one of the few areas that we are seeing reimbursement increases to try to really drive volume to some of these services that are necessary, but from payers' perspective. And really, we've seen a lot of private investors be able to leverage some growth strategies to make more access available from the assets that are currently in the market. One of the places that we're seeing that we think that there's a lot of growth potential is in multi-specialty behavioral care. That is especially true when facilities themselves have a high potential cost basis, where they have large facility requirements, significant real estate costs, high labor costs. Being able to maximize efficiencies in that area to really provide the most access to care for patients and the best available options for those modalities of care to be available, I think has been really attractive, especially with high physical infrastructure costs. This subsector, of course, it still has challenges, just like any other one that we're going to talk about. One, and probably one of the most significant areas, is continual regulatory scrutiny. This area and subsector deals with some of the most vulnerable patients in our communities and in our population, and it is very important for regulatory agencies to be very careful that those portions of the population aren't exploited. There isn't any kind of overbilling, non-compliance, lack of appropriate care. And so we expect to continue to see significant regulatory scrutiny over these subsectors. So anyone investing in them, anyone operating them needs to be very aware of that and be very mindful of those various requirements. The other is continued challenges in recruiting labor and therapists for these type of services. We see a very significant need for these services, which is creating very high demand for labor that is providing services at these sites. So we expect labor costs in these sites to remain high. We expect there to continually remain shortages of therapists and other qualified personnel. And so that is a challenge that this subsector will have to continue to deal with. This is just an example of some of the transactions that we've seen happen in the space. I'm not going to spend any time on these, but just for purposes of a data point of the type of transactions that we're talking about when we are talking about behavioral health. The next subsector I want to talk about is cardiology. Cardiology is one of the hottest subsectors that we're going to talk about, and it's being driven largely by an aging population that has significant health factors and significant increases in heart disease overall. That is driving a need and an access issue that everyone in the cardiology community is dealing with. And what we have seen is investors are uniquely suited to help solve that problem, whether they be strategic investors, payers, or private equity funds. So we think that in 2024, cardiology will continue to be one of the most sought after and competitive subspecialties that we see. And largely that's going to be due to increases in number of patients and decreases in number of physicians available to treat those patients. So what that means is existing practices are looking for efficiencies. They are looking for ways in which they can provide more high quality care to patients and less administrative burden, or increase the number of things like technology, mid-level providers, and other services that they can integrate into their practice to bring down the number of times they're spending doing admin work and increase the number of times that they're really clinically seeing patients and providing that access. So we do expect that still will remain really high due to that demand for additional infrastructure and technology in this subsector. So just to talk a little bit more about some of the drivers of this increased activity, there has been obviously the need that we just spoke about and the need for efficiencies and access. There's also been huge growth potentials of outpatient opportunities, whether it be in surgery centers or OBLs. That gives more opportunity for continuity of patient care and also more ability for independent practice growth. There are more states that we're seeing that are permitting cardiac procedures to be performed on an outpatient basis. In many instances, that has been met very positively by clinicians. Clinicians are really excited that Medicare has been adding surgeries to the covered ASC procedure list. Those are often more convenient for patients, convenient for clinicians, and less stressful. And so they really like that dynamic, which we are seeing. So we expect to continue to see outpatient procedure migration, which is, from a value perspective, very high value to independent practices. And so we think there are going to continue to be attractive areas of ancillary growth that makes this subsector ripe for investment. It also makes the subsector have a real need for capital. Both OBLs and ASCs are extremely expensive to build outside of the hospital setting and outside of having a direct capital partner. And so one thing that we're hearing from clinicians when we talk with them about this particular subsector is they have a real hesitance to sign on to, for example, personal guarantees, which they would need to do if they were to go out and get independent debt capital. So investors sometimes can be a really attractive area within those surgery centers, within those OBLs, to bring that needed capital while also allowing them to take advantage of this outpatient growth. The greater infrastructure that we see coming into cardiology practices, the greater likelihood, too, we believe that they will be prepared for value-based care, where they can control costs and the continuum of care for the particular patient. And so I think that we will continue to see that in partnership with hospitals, in partnership with management companies, but we continue to see that to be really attractive to clinicians. There's some challenges to investing in cardiology, which we've included here. One, if you are not looking to do so in connection with a hospital, that can often be a challenge because hospitals uniquely have strong connections with cardiology practices across each state in the United States and often have very intertangled relationships that if you're looking to unwind those or extract those, that can be challenging. What we're actually seeing more of is people are looking at how to do transactions that include perhaps a strategic investor or a third-party investor, a hospital, and a physician group to really lean into those strong relationships. The other thing is you have to be very mindful from a state law perspective of how cardiac cases are permitted or not permitted to be done in an inpatient setting. There are a lot of state law requirements on this issue as well as on OBLs. And so there is not a one-size-fits-all approach that you can utilize. You have to be mindful of each state's requirements, and that often takes a lot of time and bespoke negotiation, but it is something to be mindful of. And then the last is just a labor shortage. Cardiology is expected to have one of the greatest deficits for physicians through 2025. So in 2024, that's going to continue to lead to be more difficult. Anyone who's looking at investing in this space, anybody who's looking at growing this space is going to need to be particularly mindful of the ways that they can utilize mid-level providers, the way they can use technology to make sure that they are maximizing the services and access that they're able to provide to patients to really be able to meet the need. This, again, is just an example of the few of the transactions that have been going on over the last several years in the cardiology space, by no means representative, just to give you a flavor. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Brian to hit three of our other subsectors, starting with compounding and specialty pharmacy.
Hi, thanks, Kayla. Yes, hi, everybody. My name is Brian King. I am one of the attorneys practicing with Kayla very frequently, sitting here in the Charlotte office. And just as some perspective, I practiced as a pharmacist for about 10 years, and now as an attorney, I focus a lot of my practice on compounding pharmacies, specialty pharmacies, pharma services, and various other life sciences. So I'm excited to talk about some of the areas that we're seeing a lot of activity now and in the past year, where we see that going in the next year or so. So the first topic here is the compounding and specialty pharmacy sector. We've seen notable increase in deal activity for compounding and specialty pharmacies, despite all of the macroeconomic headwinds that have kind of impacted all subsectors the last year or two. We've really seen relatively high valuations in compounding and specialty pharmacy spaces, and we expect to see an increased focus on specialty medications, oncology treatments, and genetic therapies, mostly because these types of conditions require patient-specific dosage forms like injectables, infusions, topical creams, things that can only be prepared by compounding pharmacies. We are seeing a lot of compounding pharmacies being incorporated into various app-based telehealth platforms, especially for those conditions that lend themselves to telehealth evaluations like men's health, mental health evals, and weight loss have been really popular lately. And that being said, with the emergence of these telehealth platforms, there's been increased opportunity for compounding pharmacies to deliver medications that historically have been delivered in less consumer-friendly forms, and that now can be converted into chewable forms of drugs that can be discreetly packaged. We see that frequently with a lot of the men's health platforms, discreetly packaging for ED medications and various non-invasive drug delivery methods like nasal sprays and pills for other kinds of drugs and therapies that have traditionally been injectable. So a few of the drivers of activity that we think have been contributing to this increased activity. In the last few years, we've seen increased activity in specialty medications, oncology treatments, and just recently, in the last year or so, a lot of activity around compounded formulations of GLP-1s for weight loss. If you're not familiar with those, that's a category of drugs that originally is used for diabetes and also has implications for weight loss, has been really successful and has been very popular with compounding pharmacies in the last year. In 2023, we saw a lot of compounding pharmacies stepping up and preparing these drugs. They've been in a drug shortage for the last year and a half. And we expect this trend to at least continue through the first half of 2024. The FDA hasn't given any indication when these drugs might be removed from the drug shortage list. So a lot of clients are coming to us and asking us about that. Fortunately, there's not a great answer, but we have seen a lot of interest in this area, and we don't expect that to go away. And just generally, we've seen an increased acceptance for telehealth and online pharmacy platforms. And in 2024, we expect the market will continue to see new roles and partnerships for compounding pharmacies, with a lot of those pharmacies tied exclusively to telemedicine platforms. And as Kayla mentioned, each sector has its own set of challenges. With this subsector and with some of the other ones that I'm going to speak about, there are some inherent challenges, such as pharmacies and specifically compounding pharmacies have to navigate a really complex regulatory scheme, both under FDA's 503A, 503B requirements for compounding, as well as sterile compounding if they are engaging in that kind of compounding, very heavily regulated. And there's also state-specific pharmacy licensing and regulatory requirements. So those are also important to consider, especially if it's a pharmacy that not only is engaged in business in one particular state, but if they have a multi-state footprint, they'll need to carefully evaluate all the laws of the states that they're going to be shipping into. And lastly, for compounding pharmacies that are compounding drugs that are currently in a shortage, like the example that I used for semaglutide, the GLP-1s, once the FDA removes those drugs from the drug shortage list, we may see some brand name manufacturers challenging the availability of those on the market, enforcing patent rights, all still to be seen as they are still on the shortage list. And here, this is just to give you a sense of some of the deal volume that we've seen in this space. In the past several years, private equity investors have been really active. We've seen a lot of acquisitions, resulting in quite a bit of vertical and horizontal integration. And we've also seen an uptick in private equity investments in this space, consistent with what we're seeing in the pharma services section, which is the next topic that I will discuss. The pharma services sector has also attracted a lot of interest, also from private equity investors and others. And we do expect this trend to continue through 2024 and the first half of 2025. Right now, we're seeing a lot of interest in a number of specific subsectors, and those include contract research organizations, or CROs, CDMOs, which also help with, they're similar to CROs, but they also help with development, contract manufacturing organizations, CMOs, CPOs, and 3PLs. This surge in PE interest in these areas is a relatively new development, and we're seeing a lot of funds that historically have not been involved in life sciences are now starting to show more of an interest in becoming involved in this space. Over the last decade, the pharmaceutical industry has shifted its focus from traditional drugs intended to impact a broad patient population to a lot more specialized and specific precision medications for new, narrow patient populations. And in 2024, we expect to see strong performance in the CRO and CDMO spaces that I mentioned, as well as subsectors including services to services, sterile fill finish, and other specialty and ancillary services. We're also expecting to see personalized medicine continue to drive the demand for small batch manufacturing, and that Big Pharma will continue to rely on those contract manufacturers to help with capacity issues and to mitigate drug shortages, which we've seen a lot in the last year or two. And as we mentioned in our prior segments, contract manufacturers are really poised to assist when it comes to manufacturing complex therapies and those niche delivery systems that are critical for development of new vaccines, cancer treatments, and the GLP-1 drugs that we mentioned for obesity management and various genetic interventions for diseases like Alzheimer's. Next section we're going to talk about here is the payer services sector. This is another area that we've seen increased deal activity over the last year or two. Many investors seem to be diversifying their healthcare investments with certain non-provider investments. This is a good example of that. We've seen an increased interest in ancillary services such as medical review services, ancillary benefit management, IT service providers, and they're looking basically for different ways to provide the benefit of cost containment. Several factors that have contributed to the increased activity in this sector are the increased complexity in billing for different procedures, continued increases in healthcare costs, like we mentioned, and with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the U.S. market has a much larger pool of enrolled individuals. So there's just more individuals to market these services to. And since these trends are kind of expected to continue for at least the next several years, we don't really expect the demand for investment in payer services to decrease anytime soon. As the pressure to reduce healthcare costs increases, we do expect the demand for cost containment solutions to increase along with it. So we think the sector will continue to be very attractive for PE investors in the coming year. Okay, turning it back over to Kayla.
Great, thanks, Brian. So we're going to end our presentation on just two real areas. The first is post-acute care. This is an extremely broad subsector that includes many different sub-areas that I'm sure that you all have seen, such as hospice, home health, unskilled and skilled home care agencies, and then also assisted living facilities. We're seeing that these sub-areas are having extreme growth, both from an organic development perspective, but also from an investment interest perspective. Undeniably, it is because we have an aging population that is really putting greater demands on at-home care and other care services. Also, we're seeing that there has been a real increase in technology that's enabled this type of service to take off and be available to many different individuals throughout the community. So I think that home health, hospice, and unskilled areas have long been recognized as an area of interesting investment. It is undeniable that the aging population will provide significant areas of growth, but now we are seeing that come to fruition in 2023 and 2024 specifically. Currently, we're seeing really strong drive by private equity investors just due to the industry's fragmentation and the strong interest in the ability to positively impact patient care and provide these services where they're really demanded in the lack of access. However, we're starting to see more strategic buyers and payers outside of private equity looking at these opportunities and really digging into the way these can be valuable to their consumers. And so I think that we'll continue to see those areas of consolidation into 2024, likely more than we have seen them in 2023. So let's just talk a little bit more specifically about some of these drivers of increased activity. So one is the increased demand for home health and hospice. Again, like I said earlier, this is largely due to the aging population and also just people are living longer. And so we have more people that are utilizing these services for a longer period of time during their life. So we don't expect that to change, at least not here in the next several years. Because of these demographic trends, we see really substantial growth opportunities both for acquisitions, but also post-acquisition organic growth. In many communities across the country, they continue to see a major access problem and a major quality of care issue in these different verticals. And so the ability for technology, the ability for really good clinical care to step into that organic growth, I think is very positive, and there's a lot of tailwinds there. The other is just changing healthcare preferences and continued industry fragmentation. Even though there has been some consolidation in this space, it's still extremely fragmented. If you all have looked at different areas in the market, there are still very few multi-site locations with high quality clinical availability for patients in these individual subsectors. And so the ability to pull together resources, put in place standardized processes, I think is very attractive and really is likely to see a significant amount of growth in 2024. The other component is the payer dynamic. So we are continuing to see increased types of reimbursement for home health, hospice services, assisted living services, inpatient and outpatient care. And so one thing that wasn't true necessarily 10 years ago, where there were not a significant number of people with commercial long-term care insurance. There was not the level of insurance coverage overall for these services. We saw them more on a cash pay basis. As that trend has changed in most areas of the country and started to increase reimbursement, it really provides some opportunity and some greater demand for people to consume these services, and therefore has created a little bit of an access issue that organic growth can step in to fill. The other has been, there's just been some transition, like I put here on the slide, in the payment methodologies, which provides more opportunities for this benefit. Like we've talked about in some other areas, there are challenges that still exist. The biggest single challenge for this post-acute care subsector is regulatory and licensing issues. There continues to be, in many states, CON requirements that restrict, for example, skilled nursing facilities. There are continual significant licensing and regulatory requirements in order to organically develop these businesses, even in states that do not have CON. And there are obviously continual obligations to survey, monitor, and make sure you're fully in compliance with all state regulations. So that dynamic continues to be a challenging area. The other environmental challenge is just, it is a changing reimbursement environment, which provides opportunities, but it also provides challenges to make sure you're being as competitive as possible. You're making sure that you are seeking billing, coding properly to take advantage of the reimbursement to which your organization is entitled. So that continues to be a challenge that people have to navigate and have significant technology and significant expertise in order to do so properly. And then the last is labor costs. Labor costs remain a major hurdle in this area, just like in the behavioral health space that we were talking about earlier. There is a lack of skilled services for these areas. The cost of providing them is high, the cost of replacing them is high, and we don't expect that to change in the near future solely because of the demand on the services overall. So I think that we'll continue to see that here in 2024. On theme with some of the other subsectors we've talked about, these are just an example of a few of the transactions that we've seen occurring in the space for context. The last subsect that we're going to talk about is one of my personal favorites. Many of you all have probably interacted with me in the past on women's health, which is an extremely large topic area. For those of you who'd like to spend more time on this particular subsector after this discussion, we do have an entirely separate webinar series that just talks about issues within women's health. We also will have an event in connection with our conference that we host in Charlotte in September that will focus solely on women's health for several hours in the afternoon. So if you are interested in those areas, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk to you about them. We'd love to have you participate. But for now, we'll give you at least a short snippet of what we have been seeing in the women's health arena and some of the real opportunities that we think will be present in 2024. So women's health businesses continue to garner just extreme interest from private equity investors, payers, strategic investors, and technology companies. It remains very fragmented. We have seen a rise in menopause providers. We've seen a rise in fertility providers, OBGYN, imaging, oncology, you name it. There have been significant advancements in women's specific health issues, even if it isn't traditionally known as quote unquote women's health. There's a lot of drivers of that increased activity. One is just the need for women's health services. Women are by far larger consumers of healthcare than men are in this country, which means they are looking for things that are specific to their care. So fertility services, imaging, laborist programs, OBGYN, and oncology, the ability to really provide coordinated care to women in a multi-site or convenient place for them has been very demanding. The other is on value-based care. So women's health has an area a really attractive subsector for value-based care. There are significant numbers of care continuums that have fairly finite clinical processes, such as maternity or oncology bundles. We've seen those being very attractive to payers, and so payers are pushing that as well. The market remains very fragmented. We still see more 2 to 5 provider sites than we do 20 to 50 provider sites in this subsector, particularly in the fertility space, but also still in the oncology and OBGYN space as well. However, even though those groups are really quite small numbers of clinicians together, the ancillaries that they're looking to provide are quite large and often extremely expensive. And so the ability to have aggregation among providers in order to provide these services to their patients has become really attractive, or partnerships with hospitals or partnerships with other management companies has become really interesting and provides a unique opportunity to satisfy that need for ancillaries, the need for additional technology, and the need for capital while allowing providers to remain relatively independent. We've also seen some really significant advances in FemTech. You're probably aware, wearables and other technology that have really revolutionized the ability to track your own health and assess your own care. Women have been significant adopters of those pieces of technology, and so we're seeing a really significant growth in that area that we expect to continue in 2024. We talked a little bit about already the desire to bring ancillaries in-house. A lot of that has, as we've talked to clinicians, has been driven by a need to control outcomes and total clinical quality of care, the ability to bring in, for example, mammography services, and therefore be able to control exactly the radiologists that are doing the read and exactly the quality of what's being provided to your patients has been a real demand and something that we have noticed clinicians are very interested in looking at investments to be able to provide. And then they are acutely aware that their subsector is ripe for value-based care. And in order to really win at value-based care, when you talk with clinicians, we have observed that they view it as really necessary to have significant data and significant technology to then approach payers to be successful in a value-based care environment. And to do so is often expensive. To do so often requires a lot of outside expertise, and they view outside investment and outside strategic providers as being able to provide that expertise. Again, like any other subsector, we're also continually seeing some unique challenges. Many of you on the call today are likely aware that there have been some very unique challenges when it comes to FemTech. across different states in the country, there have been requests for data that women are logging into different femtech wearables or femtech apps that have become the subject of scrutiny, especially in light of different cases and other issues surrounding women's health and the ability to keep data and health information private, either from state governments or from other providers. So that is a little bit of a unique challenge that we're seeing. The data that's provided through femtech is also a unique opportunity. We've seen a significant interest in data monetization by different providers, both from a clinical trial perspective in order to continue to advance clinical care, and then also from a revenue perspective because they have a lot of unique information that can be very valuable to drug companies, and development in particular area and advances of care, and we expect to continue to see that going forward. The other challenge has been with respect to ancillaries. Ancillaries are extremely highly regulated across nearly every state in the country, and they provide unique challenges that must be navigated both from a capital perspective and from a regulatory perspective for any investor or independent practice. And so that's an area where there really has to be enough providers together to be sizable and profitable, but doing so also has to be done in compliance with all of the state law requirements. So that's something that always has to be navigated. We've already talked a lot about this next point here with respect to required capital. So we expect that is an area that will continue to be a challenge for independent providers, and the need to have significant equipment, significant technology that's very expensive, which will continue to drive the need for some outside partnership, whether it be from hospitals, strategic providers, private equity funds, or payers. And then the last is there's a couple of areas of women's health that are just a really unique regulatory environment. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the Alabama case that came down with respect to IVF services. Across the country, fertility providers are questioning similar issues, similar processes, and so the environment is very unique, specifically in fertility and OB for different state regulations. And all of my clients in those areas are focusing really specifically on state regulation to make sure they have in place proper policies and procedures in order to comply with those state laws. And anybody investing in those areas needs to be very aware of those as well. So those continue to be challenges that require education and require mindfulness to make sure you're doing everything in compliance and also everything in best clinical quality. This is an example of just a few transactions that have happened in the space, just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're seeing. Okay, I think that we have gotten a couple of questions, so I'll just take a moment to answer those. We got a question about whether or not the deck will be available and shared afterwards. It absolutely will be. If you have registered for the webinar, you will receive an automatic email that includes both the deck of the transaction as well as the recording of the transaction. And then if you'd like a copy of the white paper as well, we will send that along. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We'd always love to answer them. I think we've gotten a couple of other questions that are more specific to individual situations, and so we'll reach out separately to answer those. But we really appreciate you all participating with us today. We'd love to have you at some of our other webinar series. We frequently have one, as I mentioned, on women's health. We frequently have one relating to these different subsectors. We frequently have them on dental issues. So if any of those are of interest, please always reach out. We'd be happy to share those with you. And then again, if you'd like to join us May 8th and 9th in Chicago for our Healthcare Private Equity Conference, we'd love to have you. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out.